My name is Yefim Ayzenberg. I was born in Kiev and grew up in Kiev. In 1941, when the war began, I was conscripted into the Red Army. I was several times wounded during the war. I fought for 3 years. I ended the war in Romania. So in 1941, when I went to the army, my mother and all other relatives stayed behind in Kiev. I had an older brother, his name was Alexander. He was the hero of the Soviet Union. He was awarded this title, this merit, for his bravery during the war. He was in the Red Army from 1939 through 1946. He was an officer and he was badly wounded. He became an invalid because of his wartime wounds. So my mother expected that my brother would come from the army back to Kiev, and she waited for him, and she did not try to leave Kiev, to evacuate. I'm not sure if she could, so she stayed there. When I came back to Kiev after the war, I started trying to find out what's happened to my mother, to other relatives. I talked to our neighbors. We lived in a big apartment building, and that's where I grew up, and everybody knew me, and I knew people there. So they were not Jewish, they were Ukrainians, Russians, so they were able to survive the war, the occupation. So I started talking to them, and they told me that what happened, that the Germans ordered all the Jewish population to come to several streets nearby the Babi Yar, and from there they were taken to Babi Yar and murdered there.
I was 19 years old when the war began in 1941. My mother and I were evacuated to Uzbekistan. I was studying medicine there, but when the school moved to Moscow, I did not follow. My father had been in the Red Army. We have no idea what happened to him, how or where he died. In 1944, Kiev was liberated from the Germans, and my mother and I went home. We had no idea what happened in Kiev during the occupation. When we returned, we learned that many of our relatives were murdered at Babi Yar. One particular story that we heard was about a relative who had been in the Red Army. His unit had been destroyed, and he returned to Kiev to find his wife and children, but they had been evacuated. When his neighbors learned that he was in Kiev and in the Red Army and Jewish, they immediately denounced him to the Polizei. He was taken to Babi Yar and murdered. We heard many horror stories. My mother had a seamstress who was Russian but married a Jew. She denounced her husband to the Nazis. When the Germans came to arrest her husband, the neighbors begged her not to give up their 3-year-old son. They wanted to hide the child. The seamstress said, No, he is Jewish. Take him away too. Both the father and the child were murdered at Babi Yar. The seamstress was arrested after the war. My mother and I went to see Babi Yar. There was nothing there. It was just a place. We knew that many people had died there, but there was no sign, no memorial. It was only much later, when the story of Babi Yar became well known, that the government built a memorial. I have returned to Kiev twice since immigrating to Denver. My sister still lives there. We go together to the Babi Yar Memorial. There is a big statue and a park. It looks nice and clean. But I remember how it looked in 1944 and 1945.